I will be interviewing my grandpa, Dale Walther, about the 1964 Great Alaskan Earthquake. He grew up in Alaska and was living there when the earthquake struck. Fortunately, he survived and is here to tell us about his experience. Hi, Grandpa. Thank you for your time and willingness to participate in this interview.
You're certainly welcome.
Let's start off with some backstory about you. How old were you when you moved to Alaska, and what do you remember about life growing up there as a child?
I was 5 years old when my parents moved to Alaska, and the first thing I remember about Alaska when I got there was we had a big volcano go off. It was called Mount Spur, so we couldn't go outside and play all summer because there was volcano ash all over Anchorage. The next thing I remember was we all got chicken pox, so we had to stay in the apartment again till the rest of the summer, and we still finally got to see what it looked like outside after winter started.
Wow, that's so interesting. Now, could you tell me where the Great Alaska Earthquake hit and why it is such a prominent event in U.S. history?
Okay, the Great Alaska Earthquake occurred on March 27th, 1964. And the reason it was such an important event in history is because it was the largest earthquake that had ever been recorded for North America. On the Richter scale, it was measured at the time, by a lower number, but later it was revised to where it was now recorded as 9.2. And the location of the earthquake was in Alaska, of course. The epicenter was in what's called Prince William Sound, and Prince William Sound was approximately 150 miles from where I lived in Anchorage.
How old were you at the time of the earthquake?
At the time of the earthquake, I was in high school. I was probably about 16 years old.
How did your day start off on March 27th, 1964?
On March 27th, 1964, that day was Good Friday. And in those days, schools honored religious holidays. So we did not go to school on Good Friday. And that was probably a blessing because many students probably would have been killed if they'd stayed in some of the schools that were very severely damaged in the earthquake. And this is what happened to one of the schools. It's called the Government Hill Elementary School. You can see that many lives were spared because they were not in school during the earthquake. So the day of the earthquake, I was at home. I was doing homework at the kitchen table. And that was about 4 or 5, well, close to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, as I best remember.
Wow, that's fortunate. Where were you when the earthquake hit?
I was sitting at a kitchen table, and right behind me was a hutch cabinet with a lot of china dishes. When it occurred, I heard a lot of sound and screeching noises in the roof. And I thought, oh no, the roof is going to collapse. I was home alone with my little sister that I was babysitting. She was in her crib, but she was at the other end of the house. So I decided I better get up and pick her out of the crib and take her outside in case the roof fell down. So I got up, I left the kitchen table, I went down the hallway. As I went down the hallway, I couldn't stand up straight because the cement hallway covered with a tile was moving left up and down just like it was rubber. It wasn't solid, even though it was made out of cement. And so I had to brace myself against the walls as I moved down the hallway. I got to the bedroom where my little sister was, picked her out of her crib, and walked back towards where I had been. And there, right where I'd been sitting, all the china had opened up out of the cabinet and fallen down and broken into lots of small pieces. We then went out to the backyard and waited until the movement of the earthquake eventually stopped after several minutes.
Do you remember anything else that happened immediately after the earthquake?
Yes, the first thing that I remember after the earthquake happened was I climbed up to the top of the roof of my house to look to the downtown because we could see the tall buildings from downtown if we climbed up on our roof. And I climbed up there to see if those buildings were still erect. When I looked out to the distance, it looked like the buildings were still up. So I thought, well, maybe this wasn't such a big earthquake after all. And this photograph is taken a few days after the earthquake, but it shows where the damage on 4th Avenue. The street again dropped down. And if you look to the far left, you'll see a tall building. That's the Westward Hotel. That was the name at the time. It's now the Hilton Hotel. However, that's one of the buildings I looked at when I climbed up on the roof of my house, and I saw it still standing, so I thought, oh, maybe there wasn't so much damage after all. But you can see there was quite a bit of damage, and in fact, inside that hotel, they had a lot of damage. They had to redo and reconstruct a lot of the upper floors. And the next day or two, the scouts contacted me, the leaders for the Boy Scouts and the Explorer Scouts particularly, and asked if we would help to send messages or to provide messages to people in the city of Anchorage. because our phones were not working and the mail was not working. The only communication we had was called ham radio. It's individuals who would have their own individual way of broadcasting back and forth. So these messages would come in by ham radio, and then they had to be delivered to the businesses. And so I was, and the other Explorer Scouts, we went to the Civil Defense headquarters, and when the messages came in, we took them and delivered them directly to these areas where the city was damaged. In fact, in that part of Anchorage, the National Guard was protecting the areas so that people wouldn't come in and loot and take things because there was so much damage. But since we were with the Scouts and wearing our uniforms, we were allowed to go into those areas where other severe damage was and got to actually see the damage. And I took some pictures as a Boy Scout when I was in those areas that I probably otherwise wouldn't have been able to get access to.
Thank you for sharing. Do you personally know anyone who was injured or worse during the earthquake?
I did. Some years later, I worked in a correctional facility in Alaska, and one of the inmates there had a rough life after the earthquake because his wife had been killed in the earthquake, and he didn't respond to that very well and ended up doing some things that got him in jail.
Oh.
But she was in a car parked in front of a department store. It was a JCPenney department store in downtown Anchorage, and the slabs of concrete on the side of the department store fell off in the earthquake and crushed her car. What's interesting about that, though, is that the night before, I was with my Explorer Scout group. We were doing a fundraising project selling what was called pulp directories. They're like a city directory, similar to a telephone directory, but we're selling them to businesses. And we were walking and selling them right in that very same street, right under where those cement blocks fell on that lady the next day.
Wow. So adding on to this, what types of damage was caused to your surroundings by the earthquake?
Well, in my immediate surroundings, most of the damage was things like books falling off the shelves, and there were some cracks in the floor. It had snowed that day. Remember, this is Alaska, even though it was in March, late March. And so that day of the earthquake, my brothers and sisters and I had built some snow forts and snowmen in the backyard, and those all fell over in the earthquake.
How long did it take to rebuild your community after the destruction?
Well, the U.S. government was very helpful. They offered what were called 3% loans, which at that time was a very, very good loan rate for any business that wanted to recuperate. And many businesses took advantage of that and began to rebuild. It was several years. It took a while.
Okay, and lastly, I'd like to ask, how did the 1964 Alaska earthquake affect you and your family going forward?
Well, it had a lot of different effects on us. I think one of the ways it affected me is it caused me to look at things a little bit differently because I had a different experience I would never have otherwise had. So I think I appreciated more some of the things that I might not have appreciated when I realized that we had gone through such an experience and survived it and been able to continue on with our lives.
Wow, that was an incredible interview. I didn't realize how massive and destructive the 1964 Great Alaskan Earthquake was and the impact it had on the state of Alaska, even hundreds of miles away from the epicenter. I was also encouraged to learn that my grandpa was able to help his community after the earthquake in his role as a Boy Scout. Grandpa, I'd like to thank you for providing me with personal photos from your childhood and for sharing your experiences during the 1964 Great Alaskan Earthquake. Thank you again for your time and for participating in this interview.
Well, thank you. You're very welcome.